Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hindal Jeda, and I'm a senior at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar, majoring in art history. I am very pleased and honored to have the great chance to introduce our next speaker, Shahzia Sikander. She graduated from National College of Arts in Lahore, Pakistan, and later moved to the United States, where she earned a master's degree in painting and printmaking from the Rhode Island School of Design. Since that time, she has established herself as an artist through solo and group exhibitions all over the world, and locations throughout the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Ireland, Australia, and Hong Kong, including at the Hirshhorn in 1999 and the Whitney in 2000. She works in a wide variety of media and methods, including drawing, painting, printmaking, animation, performance, video, and more. She had received numerous awards, including a MacArthur in 2006 and the National Medal of Arts in 2012. Her talk today is entitled The Future of the Indo-Persian Miniature Painting Tradition, and will explore the dynamism of form and its living relationship to those historical traditions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Shahzia Sikander. Thank you.
लागी लगन तो से रैन अंधेरी डराए, जियरा मोरा लर्जे अब के चैन न आए।
So when the Philadelphia Museum of Art reached out to me in 2015 to develop a multidimensional work to bring their permanently owned manuscript, the 18th century manuscript Gulshan-e-Ishq, to life, the first thing that came to my mind was provenance. I began by analyzing who and what was this manuscript, who commissioned it, who painted it, who wrote it, in what language was it written, who translated it, who determined the story, how did it end up at the PMA? Was this 18th century manuscript Islamic art because it was made under Islamic patronage in Central India or South Asian? So before I share my work further, I want to give you a sense of what drives me to create, because this symposium is fundamentally about art and the process of creativity. And I also want to take a moment to thank you all for including me in this debate. It is a great honor, indeed. It is challenging to unpack what we mean as Islamic art, but then we all know that too. So let me say that as an artist, it is even more compelling to add to this ongoing determination of Islamic art, since the stakes are so much higher. Dislocation of objects, ideas, concepts, and forms, and how meaning is constantly in flux, captures my imagination. Historically, the movement of objects and bodies, such as in trade, slavery, migration, colonial occupation, has forced meaning to shift and oscillate with every generation. When one thinks in terms of narratives and how history, including art history, is determined, how real is that account? All histories are about redaction. Imagination, thus, is very much about taking ownership of the narrative, and art remains a fundamentally political stance. The Gulshan-e-Ishq was written in 1657 by Nusrati, court poet, to Sultan Ali Adil Shah II of Bijapur. The poem is also written in Dakkani Urdu and Persian Naqsh script, the language of the Muslim elite in South Central India, a North Indian Hindu love story recast as a Sufi tale for an Islamic court. So my 10-minute film, Disruption as Rapture, whose short clip you just saw, reinterprets Nusrati's poem in Masnavi format. The reference to Sufi enlightenment and Hindu devotional bhakti is explored through forms created from female hair, as well as wings choreographed as particle systems that function as connecting tissue, while carrying the theme of strife and the struggle for truth. Much like the metaphor used to convey the manuscript's core message, the work explores elements from Hindu and Muslim lyrical poetry to create an improvised passage into a devotional process. The collaborative spirit of the work is reflected in the multiplicity of oral and visual languages, as well as in the work's elasticity to be experienced in multiple sites and situations, not just within the South Asian art galleries of the PMA. So I recently shared this work at the Aga Khan Museum, which is where it was installed outdoors on LED screens. It also was showing at the Karachi Art Biennial currently, which closes this weekend. Velocity, magnitude, and direction all become essential aspects in creating time. The audience is no longer limited to the museum. The single unit of the female hair silhouette has tremendous possibilities, at once singular and representational, when reproduced and choreographed in the millions as moving images. The hair silhouettes oscillate between several representations, such as the sun, spheres, swarms, birds, bats, or insects, here descending every midnight for a month in Times Square on over 30, 40 billboards. What emerged was the kinetic thrust, the enormous energy charge of this motif of the hair, culled from its female representation, to occupy a space beyond the archives so that the story is freed to witness its own history and empower its own narrative, functioning as a force, an engine for survival. Drawing is a thinking, notational tool, a fundamental language through which I construct a range of works and formats to engage with the world. When I joined the National College of Art in Lahore, and it was the 1986 to 87 session, I was in an intuitive mode, seeking what would speak to me. I gravitated towards miniature painting, an anomaly amidst the highly westernized teaching methods, a traditional art form seen then as derivative and cliched, incapable of intellectual rigor. Miniature painting as a contemporary form was then largely unknown to the global contemporary art world, as the Euro-American canon dominated the field of painting. Coming to art from a background in math, I was interested in language and application, and not hierarchies. Homosexuality, for example, and its precarious existence within the Punjabi culture of Lahore became a topic, layered further by stylizing my gay protagonist into a Mughal portrait, then layering further with iconographies of gender to punctuate the androgynous within the eroticized space of the miniature. Humor, irony, wit, and self-critique remain instrumental in my dialogue with the historical Indo-Persian miniature. Adam Smith, the economist and philosopher, author of The Wealth of Nations, argued against monopolies, using the demise of the East India Company as a case study. However, we are still caught in the same old patterns of inequities of wealth. So for my depiction of Adam Smith, I fashioned him in the company school of miniature painting, which emerged under the colonial rule. Strapped in the company attire, his lofty ideas grow wings, but unable to fly, he remains fluttering in the economics building of Princeton University. But more on this later, because I will share the documentary on the making of this work at the end of this presentation. I was born in Lahore, Pakistan, to a family of storytellers. My first memory is of my father reading to me Kornei Tchaikovsky's book, Unusual Tales, at that time translated into Urdu. His creative freedom in customizing the tales as he read out loud was infectious and entertaining, and it signaled to me as a young child to be inventive. But growing up in Pakistan in the 1980s under a military regime that incessantly institutionalized religion was a deeply conflicting experience. The Hudud ordinances, which limited women's rights, loomed large. I grew up in a multi-family house with an intrinsic mix of secular, spiritual, and religious Muslimness. By 9, I had read the Quran several times and learned much of it by heart in Arabic, a language I did not understand, and realized that rote was not my calling. Though I loved my Muslim religious celebratory rituals of fasting, Eid, prayers, and zakat, I also had enthusiasm for my concurrent Catholic schooling, choir practice, and participating in the annual Christmas play. I had a probing mind, an independent nature, and a spunky imagination to compete with the boys. Miraj, the visionary night journey and accession of the Prophet Muhammad, is one of Islam's most mystical themes. My interest stems from childhood familiarity and Miraj as a metaphor for the emotional trust necessary in seeking artistic truth. In Portrait of the Artist series, traditional Miraj paintings are cited to create a link to a historical site. The visual references to the Miraj paintings are mute, like fossils in time, containing within them an internal order. Within the crystallized representations of the mirage, the artist's portraits function as vessels through which history passes. Early on, I started playing with ideas of center and margin by dislocating framing devices to open up narratives of gender, sexuality, and race. Ismat Chugtai, Kishwar Nahid, started conversing with Fatima Mernisi, Helen Susu, as I started to manipulate the established forms and pictorial conventions. Luckily, the complex plurality I had experienced as a child in Pakistan allowed me to navigate a multitude of categories as I negotiated a sense of belonging in the West. Pakistani, Muslim woman, South Asian, Asian American, all were lenses I encountered as the other. Using creativity as a tool and embracing the potential of multiplicity instead of rigidity or singularity, I channeled the frustrations into fodder for more work, for more searching into the proverbial East-West contested histories. The play with space and disruptions of scale became essential. In addition to unsettling compositional and iconographical content, the work engaged with destabilizing the medium of drawing itself. So I began experimenting with the wall and floor as drawing surfaces while I was a student at RISD, but I also started to add depth to my wall drawings beyond the two-dimensional spheres by creating ephemeral installations out of multiple sheets of translucent paper and also light as a medium. What captures my imagination about writing is its inherent ability to redact. Redaction is a critical issue, especially in terms of how history is constantly being rewritten in both cultural and political spheres. Inspired by geometric and visual nature of Arabic script, writing the written also imagines the importance of writing in Islam. Playing with signatures of independence from the US Constitution, the independence of authority. So this is a very tricky subject, but I was interested in it because I was questioning what happens to authority over time. So how do we move forward, especially when we encounter a stalemate? So what is Islamic art? Does such a category trap or inform? The scroll, which was a much celebrated work I created in Pakistan as a young artist, was a game changer for miniature painting department. At more than 5 feet, it took me almost like a year of 18 hours a day to make the work. Abandoning the expected notebook scale and illustrations of traditional rituals like flying, kite flying festivals or weddings, the scroll explored the impact of youth and the narrative as a moving image by looking at narrative structures in film and cinema, but also as well as looking at light in Safavid painting. Here are some details of the work. So, desexualized figures, androgyny as subject, was also a dig into beauty as monstrous. Sissu's idea of the female writing or white ink, as in The Newly Born Woman, alongside Bhupen Khakkar and Eva Hesse's post-minimalist, soul-injecting female forms, I could trace my own relationship with the male-dominated miniature painting field. In some of the works, the white ink as a visual metaphor was also a play on the use of white gouache, the opaque, or gadrang of miniature. So here the line is just placed on top of the male. If you took a magnifying glass and looked under, you would actually see that it is the image of the male. So Monsters to Midgets was an indirect arrival to the human form. I was subverting the dead decorative art in books on Islamic art by infusing their form and physicality with a perceived lurking vitality. The visual lexicon that I started to develop almost was a parallel to the text present in my work. So here you can see some of the forms that, these are just sort of forms that I added here to show where some of the elements were being inspired by. Art has been such a deeply personal vehicle for me to confront the uncertainties, hierarchies, misrepresentations, as well as the expunged. Parallax embodies power and conflict, but also omission and loss. Aquatic pathways, aerial routes, the operations embedded in migration, maritime trade, geographical borders that separate bodies of land, water, humans, commodities, natural and man-made resources such as oil, opium, and tea all function as concepts that contribute to the sense of belonging or exclusion from a geographically determined space. Parallax also got realized in an abandoned cinema that I encountered in one visit to a small port town, Corfacan, in UAE. I was also looking at images in British petroleum magazines and came across this photograph that actually said that it was a Christmas tree, and then I was not aware that at that time that oil rigs were termed as Christmas trees. So I was like, that's a very English sense of humor, the gift-bearing sentiment perhaps. So I ended up making the Christmas trees, and then they are also one of the iconographical elements in the film. So, so driving around and coming across this space and also realizing that it looked familiar, it reminded me of so much of the architecture in Pakistan in strange ways. So, of course, once I went inside and encountered the caretaker, who actually was from Pakistan, but who had come to build the space as a laborer in 1976. And he told me that he shared all the architectural drawings, and indeed it was created by Pakistani engineers. This is a time before the star architects were making architectural spaces in UAE. So this is a very interesting moment in time because I'm also interested in this transient encounter. I was looking at the individual that his existence was so intricately intertwined with this space. His visa was still attached to the building. That the imminent death of the cinema, in my eyes, became a metaphor for his life's labor. So the caretaker, as the sole survivor, became the protagonist in Parallax.
مسه الدهر فهلت أدمعي ليلي جبين الفجر بدد ذا النوى. يا لقاء الأمس هيا فاشفعي، صفع الحزن سنيني وارتوى. عصف البؤس وأدمى أضلعي، كم تردى في فرحي قد صوى. وتهاوى الشوق يغزو مضجعي، قد تعثرت بحظي فالتوى. كاحل الحظ غدا لم يرجعي، ويح شعري ويح شعري لاح موتي واكتوى. وفد قلبي والهوى لم يفزعي، ذاك نبض الطهر ذاك نبض الطهر يسري مرعوى. وشموخي لم يهن لم يضرعي، يا شهي البوح يا شهي البوح جرحي من طوى. في عيوني قد تبدى مطمعي، فاسكبي الأحلام فاسكبي الأحلام هيا والدواء. لا تبالي بالشقاء في ظلال العمر، قلبي قد هوى. مسه الدهر فهلت أدمعي.
So I was thinking of poetry, of course, as an agency, but I was also thinking of poetry of Sami al-Qasim, Mahmoud Darwish. I Have a Seat in the Abandoned Theater, the evocative imagery of despair and interconnected fate. All of it was deeply resonant, especially Darwish's message of strength and about the tenacity of human spirit. So this search for an epic experience, also from a very personal act, the act of drawing, came from like Walcott's epic poem Omeros, as well as Iqbal's poems Shikwa and Jawab-e Shikwa. So music, which is a significant part of this work, was composed by my long-term collaborator, Duyan, who also won a Pulitzer this year in the classical category, music category. The poems are written for Parallax by local contemporary poets, which address geographical and emotional cartographies describing how possession, ownership, rule, battles can take place in both a concrete physical location as well as the elusive terrain of memory and minds. Critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration are the three tenets on which I have built my entire understanding of being an artist. So in 2016, my work Utopia from 2003 resurfaced as cover for the Brooklyn Rail issue during the US presidential elections. So my work is always in dialogue with its time. Art engages the heart, and heart functions as a filter for truth. Within the work of art, the elasticity of the form is its ability to remain relevant over its various iterations within geographical, historical, socio-political, cultured, gendered, psychological transformations. So in this particular work, there's a reference to Langston Hughes, Portrait of Death, and Nasir Jones, the musician. The painting explores multiple modes of storytelling from the vantage point of New York City, a place of integration and turmoil that is still coming to terms with its many underrepresented narratives, including its African-American history. So in 1999, New York Times Magazine invited me to reflect on a topic that could be a turning point in the next century. My response was the interface of American policy in Islamic countries and the complexity of political foes and friends and the role reversals. So the work appeared in 1999 as part of the Imagining the Millennium magazine issue, but it was 2 years, of course, before September 11th, so it was considered a prescient work. Though it was made almost 20 years ago, it was only reviewed this year. And when it resurfaced in a show on South Asian diasporic art. So which is interesting because 20 years before, I was not considered a diasporic artist. So I was going to read just a little bit of quote from the review in Hyperlogic. It's a surprisingly prescient piece that grapples with what would become the more pronounced fault lines of the 21st century: money, war, religion, terrorism, censorship, and more. Sikander's small work suggests a continuity rather than a break with history, even if her work effortlessly blends traditional Mughal miniature technique with the language of graphic novels, history with pop culture, the New York art world's infographic sensibilities of the 1990s, with historic struggle, and of course, the politics of its time. To determine art as Islamic or not is a rigid premise, one that can never produce an overarching, consistent position. In my own experience of 30 years, many curators and art institutions have trouble dealing with complex and transnational art. The term Islamic art itself has evolved into a slippery protagonist, just like the mythical beast of burden. It is elusive and yet omnipresent in art history and in its kinship to the broader lack of imagination regarding Islam in current state of the world. So then, yes, the stakes are higher, especially for artists that are searching through the rubric of politicized Muslim histories, whose works don't fit in any dominant narratives, and whose searching is fundamental to counter the narrow definitions and intellectual crisis, as well as emergence of terror as a defining political aesthetic force on the global stage. And of course, fear at the root of one's understanding of one's self has never contributed to any good art. So therein lies the challenge as artists to navigate such a cultural moment without being defined by it. So I would like to conclude with a short documentary of this particular permanent work, which just opened at the Princeton University.
Shahzia, someone who does work that draws on certain iconographic elements, but working ultimately in a language that we felt would adapt extremely well to the two most public spaces in the building.
They invite contemplation, they invite reflection, they challenge us, they ask us to question their meaning and their intent and their symbols, because they actually invite the viewer to understand what these symbols mean, and so they're very provocative in that way.
We wanted it to stoke conversation, to remind people that we are in a world where people think of things very differently and have different cultural perspectives, and yet also just brought vibrancy to this building.
A part of each of the works is the combination of scale, materiality, and content. Even though relative to the glass piece, there's a lot of glass in the building, none of it is elsewhere used in the same way. The mosaic piece is a wholly new kind of material injection into the building.
Imagination is something that allows me as an artist to call information from the past, find a link to it that links past to present, present to future. And it's also about taking ownership of narrative, and within that premise, I see the act of imagination as a fundamentally political stance. What does an image mean when it's unhinged from its own representation?
Yeah, right. It would be more rigid, the variation of
The drawings on paper, especially in historical miniatures, don't end at the edge, but hint at a narrative that continues beyond. So even if one looked at the folios of the Princeton University Library's late 16th century manuscript that also inspired this work, you will notice that there's an aspect of infinity in those drawings. That idea has always been at the core of my dismantling traditional miniature paintings.
I started to think of the iconography that is within my work and how certain elements have a very strong relationship to history, and how some of the trenchant historical symbols I have been invested in resurrecting them and altering their meaning and shifting their context to see what type of potential there lies within them, that they can be, that they can open up new avenues of meaning and interpretation.
Animation was a natural outcome of my interest in storytelling. Like recent animations have expanded to multi-channel immersive works. Animation like The Last Post and Parallax explore colonial legacy of trade, as well as like the circulation of objects and ideas.
Parallax was showing in multiple places in 2016, and I was thinking also in terms of a scroll-like space for Princeton. So suddenly there was this epiphany that what if I took the cinematic space and turned it upside down?
But maybe these dark lines? Mm-hmm. I wanted to be involved and not just send an image for a paint-by-number reproduction.
This can be a little bit less.
The sensitivity with which the material of glass is transformed is intrinsic to the final experience of the work.
That particular image of the feminine form with no head and it's self-rooted has so much resonance. That image still signifies the expunging of the feminine from histories, from religions, from cultures, from our political discourse.
The notion of globe as the body and Africa as its heart had deep resonance for me, and I wanted to bring that idea into the mosaic mural. Art can engage the heart, and heart functions as a filter for pursuit of truth. The complexity of beauty is that it can be awe-inspiring, sensorial, sublime. The tension between craft and meaning is almost essential to imagination. Portraiture, too, is like a motif. It's not about a person or a personality. The figure and its skeletal counterpart are about life and death, imagination and lack of imagination. Quintuplet effect plays with this tuplet notation in music. I was thinking of density and layering, packing and unpacking. There are 5 ideas or notes compressed in this work. There is reference to American capitalism through my painting The Big Ritz. Then there's the spiritual dimension, portrait of Stasis, portrait of Adam Smith, and an outline of one of the historic Mirage paintings. There is history and then there's storytelling happening in both the works, especially on ideas around redaction. Then there's the perception of authority, there's power hierarchies, independence. What is freedom? What is freedom, especially within the economic global patterns that link all humans? Creativity has no national, racial, or religious boundaries. It is the power of imagination that fosters new discourse and creates new frontiers. With imagination comes humility and inventiveness.
So I
think I will conclude here. Thank you very much. I look forward to our Q&A later. Thank you.